Uhuru Sasa, which means freedom now in Kiswahili. And we just heard the Jazz Zone, Tea and Providence, paid tribute to Malcolm Jamal Warner, the late great Malcolm Jamal Warner. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And he holds a PhD from Columbia University and a JD from UC Berkeley. And he earned his BA from Princeton. And he is the author of about 50 books now. And how is the latest book doing on the capital of slavery doing? How is that doing as we speak?
As we speak, let me mention to begin with that on Friday, October 10th, in Brooklyn, Sister's Place on Nostrand Avenue at 6:30 p.m., we're having a book launch, Be There or Be Square. And then on the following Friday, October 17th, we're doing it again at Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland, at a substantially larger venue at the same time. Let me also take the opportunity to mention some breaking news, which is that Japan is in the process, it appears, of having what is reported as its first woman prime minister, although somehow in the back of my mind, I recall a woman prime minister. I may be wrong, but anyway, Sanae Takaichi styles herself as the Margaret Thatcher of Tokyo, of Japan. And there hangs a tale, because with regard to foreign policy, the Japanese nationalists who she represents historically have taken intermittently an anti-U.S. position. Notice I did not necessarily say anti-U.S. imperialism position. You may recall in the 1980s when there was a book published by Shintaro Isahara, who was the leader, or as it said there, the governor of Tokyo, and Akio Morita, the CEO of Sony, which is still with us. They published this book, The Japan That Can Say No. It ruffles feathers on this side of the Pacific. It was even interpreted as being, quote, anti-white, unquote, which meant it was a throwback to the Pacific War of 1941 to 1945, which eventuated in an atomic bombing of Japan. My own estimate is that Prime Minister in waiting Takaichi is going to have to make some compromises, because the Japanese nationalists also have lusted after subjugating China, having China be their version of Africa, just like Africa was plundered to propel the North Atlantic community. It was thought in the 1930s that the plundering of China would allow Japan to rise accordingly. Obviously, that's out of the question, although it appears to be out of the question, I should say more cautiously. Likewise, the Japanese nationalists, part of their signature policy from 1910 to 1945 was plundering the Korean Peninsula. And the present liberals in power in Seoul take a position unlike their conservative predecessors in terms of trying to have outreach to Korea and not necessarily outreach to Tokyo. So I think that Tokyo, under the leadership of Prime Minister in waiting Takaichi, is probably going to have to back off of this anti-US position, although it's not going to be easy, because recall that as a part of this trade deal just negotiated between Tokyo and Washington, supposedly Japan agreed to invest $550 billion at the behest of Mr. Trump, with him being the signatory. That's ruffles feathers in Japan. I don't think Mr. Trump is going to back off of that, which is going to make it easy. It won't make it easy for Tokyo to compromise with Washington. And likewise, I think that it may be possible to have a compromise with Seoul, because the barriers there are not as formidable with regard to the barriers of a compromise between Tokyo and Washington or Tokyo and China, for example. Since I have the mic, let me also mention a few other points that we need to consider, because as you know, one of the reasons we engage in this discourse on a regular basis so that we can have an understanding of global trends so that we can better plot strategy and tactics. To that end, let me mention a couple of points that are worthy of consideration. There are those in our audience who I'm sure are familiar with the Ryder Cup, this golf competition between the Europeans and the United States. It unfolded in the last few days in the United States. Mr. Trump attended, by the way, being a golf nut. And what was striking was the contempt shown by the US audience to European golfers. If that had been Black people dropping F-bombs and hurling drinks at competitors' spouses and all the like, we'd have a whole dialogue about Black families, alleged reported failures of Black mothers. It was quite remarkable, and has attracted attention in the sports pages, which is one of the reasons why it may not have broken into the larger news conversation. And likewise, in terms of trying to keep an eye on important trends, there are tensions erupting as we speak between France and Germany. Those two nations have been the locomotive of the European Union. But right now, they're squabbling over who will build the major fighter plane of the EU. Will it be concentrated in France? Will it be concentrated in Germany? This does not necessarily bode well for the EU. It doesn't necessarily even bode well for US imperialism. The fact that Germany might be on the verge of rearming in a muscular fashion. And finally, before I turn the mic over, let me say that with the United States heading backward ideologically, we may be returning to an era that we thought may have been eclipsed. I'm talking about the time when those of us behind the Cotton Curtain in the Deep South, we had to behave ourselves in a different fashion from those north of the Mason-Dixon line. And excuse my being vague, but let me mention a point that my mother might have mentioned if she was still in the land of the living, which is that you might want to pray for us down there behind the Cotton Curtain, particularly for your weekly commentator, Gerald Horne, for example. I thought that spending a good deal of the year in British Columbia could have led me to seek asylum, but sadly that was foiled. And so now I'm back here behind the Cotton Curtain. And as my mother might have said, you might want to pray for me. And likewise, you know that I'm on the verge of completing the research on this book on comparative settler colonialism, British Columbia versus Oregon and the state of Washington. Let me state the obvious. I mean, it's a shame in a sense that the US left has not recognized that to this point. Of course, I've been stressing it repeatedly, which is that if you look at settler colonialism and the uprooting of the indigenous, a lot of the energy for that came from the grassroots and settler descendants. It's not unlike what's happening on the West Bank, for example. It's not just coming from the military. In fact, the military in the US Northwest oftentimes had to be egged on to attack the Cayuse and the Walla Walla, for example. And it was the working class and middle class settler descendants who decided at a certain point to take up guns on their own because they thought that the military was too weak-kneed. And of course, you can draw a straight line from that to the class collaboration that is inherent in settler colonialism, manifested most recently in November 2024 when Mr. Trump got 77 million votes, and of course now has led me personally to wonder about my safety and security behind the Cotton Curtain.
Dr. Horne, I don't want to. I have a question for you. We might not have enough time to deal with it, but could you talk about the relationship of African people and Japanese, and the Japanese government and the citizens or the residents, Japanese residents of the United States?
Well, that's a very tricky question. As you know, I've written about that in my book, Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Rise of Afro-Asian Solidarity. The Japanese nationalists made appeal to the Black nationalists. Therein lies the concept of the Asiatic Black man, which is still with us, although those who invoke it, I don't think that they're aware of its historical roots. As I said in that book, in November 1942 in East St. Louis, Illinois, Black Americans were in uniform and military drills, anticipating an invasion by Imperial Japanese forces of North America that they were going to join hand in glove with the Japanese, for example. Many of the Black nationalist formations that have survived to this point, such as an organization we know as the Nation of Islam, were part of these forces. You also see it on the personal level. Look at the team I've selected to be the winner of the World Series in baseball. Their manager, Dave Roberts, forces of African and Japanese ancestry. Of course, there were many such unions in Southern California, in your own hometown in particular. I can rattle off a number of friends. For example, Hal Fairchild, a noted academic psychologist in the Southland, is a product of that union, of such a union. And it's going to be interesting to see with the ascension of Prime Minister in waiting Takaichi, which is, I assume, is what led you to make this inquiry, of whether or not her Japanese nationalism will lead to a resuscitation of that 1930s outreach to Black nationalism in the United States of America.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Black Power 96. Linda, I know you have some questions.
Yeah, like let's go to the Trump 21-point plan.
Well, as we know, since October 7, 2023, there has been a war between the Palestinians and the Israeli state. As President Macron has stated, and as I have repeated, just before October 7, 2023, there were 25,000 Hamas fighters. In succeeding months, about 10 to 12,000 were killed. But as of October 5th, 2025, there are more than 25,000 fighters. As a result, you see that the Israelis and their US patron are seeking to win at the negotiating table what they could not win on the battlefield. That is to say, the surrender of Hamas, the surrender of their weapons, etc. The problem for Hamas is that they're under unremitting pressure from their alleged comrades and allies, speaking of the Saudis, the Qataris, Turks, even the Egyptians, to come to some sort of resolution of this conflict. It reminds me of the Oslo process of some decades back, which many Palestinians have criticized subsequently, although I must say, in terms of their criticisms, they oftentimes don't take into account the fact that the PLO felt the necessity to compromise because their then ally, speaking of the socialist camp, was then imploding. Of course, let's not even talk about our friends here in the United States who have repeatedly failed to understand how the implosion of the socialist camp had negative consequences for liberation movements, not least in Southern Africa. But that's another story for another day. In any case, even if Hamas comes to some sort of agreement, which they appear to be in the process of doing, about the Trump peace plan, I don't think the peace plan is workable. I mean, for example, notice how they've hedged on Hamas surrendering their weapons. Steve Witkoff, the billionaire real estate investor who is the lead negotiator for US imperialism, used the term that they should decommission their weapons, whatever that means. And it seems to me that Hamas could say, yeah, okay, we'll decommission the weapons, just like they've been able to store so-called hostages away without their being detected. They can store weapons away without their being detected likewise, and be ready to fight at the drop of a hat. And so this process that we're now seeing unfold is unworkable. And Mr. Trump, of course, he's not a detail guy, as was said. He just wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And I think the Nobel Peace Prize will be announced this coming week. I don't think he'll get it, but hey, I've been wrong before. In any case, if he does get it, perhaps he can now feel that he's matched Barack Obama, who got the Nobel Peace Prize. Perhaps this may lead to what others have been pointing to. And I'm not sure if I agree, but I'll mention it anyway in the interest of being complete. Aaron David Miller, a former negotiator for U.S. imperialism in this conflict, has said that Mr. Trump has pressured Netanyahu in a way that Netanyahu has not been pressured before. I'm not so sure about that, but if you accept that premise, then that also bespeaks, once again, in terms of trying to develop a global analysis, that there might be many bumps in the road with regard to this Israel-U.S. relationship. And I think in terms of the Zionist billionaires in the United States who've thrown in their lot with U.S. imperialism, let me say to you and your audience what I oftentimes say to classes. You may recall what happened more than a century ago when Leo Frank, a Jewish businessman in Georgia, was lynched by militant Christians, militant Protestants, for supposedly violating and killing a Christian girl. Interestingly enough, he tried to point the finger of accusation at a Black janitor as being the culprit, but he was not believed. And I think that what the Zionist billionaires need to recognize is that, yes, they can be invited into the highest reaches of the U.S. ruling class, but these religious sectarianism forces who have spearheaded the formation of the United States of America like to retain anti-Jewish fervor, or what is popularly called anti-Semitism, as a cudgel through which they can club their so-called comrades of the Jewish faith at an appropriate moment. The Zionist billionaires should not forget that lesson of history.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this. Sorry, had you completed your thought? There was a Vietnamese comrade. I think he was the only person to reject a Nobel Peace Prize. Am I correct in saying that? And what was that comrade's name?
I don't know. It might have been Lee Duc Tho or Pham Van Dong. Of course, I think, who was the chap? Tom Lehrer, the satirist who just passed from the land of the living. He said that satire died when Henry Kissinger was given the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
And I think that he made a solid point with regard to that. Yes, Lee Duc Tho declined the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right. Has anyone done that before or since?
I'm not sure. I tend to doubt it because who can reject tens of thousands of U.S. dollars?
Vietnamese are a tough set of folks.
Well, that leads to my question: is the Nobel Peace Prize even relevant? When you're nominating George Bush and all these leaders that actually perpetuate war, how is it even a peace prize anymore?
Point well taken. And in that vein, let me also mention that the colonial viceroy of this international protectorate of Palestine, now envisioned in Gaza, will be none other than former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, who has blood on his hands with regard to the catastrophic invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein in 2003. As they say in U.S. television, that's jumping the shark. It's reached the point of absurdity that Tony Blair is being brought out of mothballs to be a colonial viceroy after all of the horror and pain he's afflicted on West Asia.
And another thing about that Nobel Peace Prize is named after a man who invented dynamite, I believe.
You are correct. And he tried to basically have a kind of penance by giving away the money for supposedly peace, but once again, the fact that F.W. de Klerk, the last apartheid leader of South Africa, could be given a Nobel Peace Prize, Henry Kissinger, it's really been cheapened. And in that regard, it would be utterly appropriate for Mr. Trump to be the latest recipient of this tarnished award.
And Miguel San Vicente, the co-owner of a different book list in Toronto, told me that the biggest selling book that he has in the store at the moment is Assata, Assata Shakur's autobiography. Can we talk about Assata right now?
Well, as you know, if you go to kpfk.org and go to archive and scroll down to Freedom Now, which airs 11 a.m. Pacific on Saturday, you will find our tribute to Comrade Assata, which I must say, of all the tributes, it was probably the mother of all tributes that she was accorded. And of course, there, and also on the Activist News Network program that we broadcast on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. Pacific, we mentioned 2 points that oftentimes were lost sight of. One, that Comrade Assata was in the fine tradition of Maroons, those who escaped the jurisdiction of our oppressors. For example, the Great Dismal Swamp on the North Carolina-Virginia border, where we are told the late drummer Max Roach had ancestral roots there. We're speaking of Maroons of Jamaica, who have received considerable attention in the historical literature. We're speaking of the Maroons of Brazil. We recommended the Brazilian film Quilombo, Quilombo, for those who want to be acquainted, at least in the dramatic sense, with that spectacular Maroon enclave in Brazil. And of course, it goes without saying that we should salute and honor Cuba for opening its doors for Comrade Assata and keeping her away from the clutches of those who were offering, by the way, tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars, if she were to be turned over. But the Cubans held fast, which we have come to expect, just like we expect them to hold fast with regard to all of this loony war talk about invading Caracas, Venezuela, which I'm afraid to say might be in the offing.
Had you ever heard the story that Assata wanted to actually go to Grenada, and she was basically told that, we are, our population probably could be held inside the Los Angeles Coliseum, and we think you should maybe bypass us and look towards Cuba, since they would be better able to handle the onslaught if they came after her.
I don't know that story, but it wouldn't surprise me if the New Jewel movement, under the leadership of late Comrade Morris Bishop, would have extended an invitation to Comrade Assata between 1979 and October 1983. But alas, I'll have to wait for confirmation from yourself and other sources.
All right, I know there's more you have to say about Assata.
Well, only that she was part, we are told, of the Black Liberation Army. She was in prison. She was able to escape prison because of the assistance of her comrades. And that while in Cuba, she was rather reticent because she felt, understandably, for example, that the then Governor Chris Christie of New Jersey recalled that the episode that led to her fleeing took place on the New Jersey Turnpike, and that Republican governor and former U.S. Attorney Chris Christie thought it would be the crowning glory if he could get her hands on her, but alas, he failed.
I remember one time being in Brooklyn, and I actually heard the comrade that was murdered when they were on the turnpike, Zaid Malik Shakur. I actually heard him speak. I remember it was summer it was burning up inside in Brooklyn, and there were like people. They had speakers on the outside. I mean, there was literally hundreds of people listening to. I think it was a minister of information for the Harlem chapter, but Zaid was a great speaker, and I did some research on him, and I think his father was actually a Sunni Muslim, so he came from an Islamic, a background. He wasn't not Nation of Islam, but they were actually Sunnis, and I guess his father would, if he's still alive, would be in his 90s or 100 plus. So you can read that in a New York Times story about Zaid Malik Shakur.
Well, before time expires, let me mention a number of other points. One, the spreading unrest in both Morocco and Madagascar. Morocco, objection by the youth to a deficit in spending on healthcare and education, while spending runs amok with regard to the World Cup, the football or soccer championship, which is slated for Morocco, and cities like Tangiers and Rabat and Casablanca have been on fire. Let me also say in this context, once again, to point to Freedom Now, a week or so ago, we had the interview with the noted West African historian, M. Ousmane Traoré, who talked about his book, which in part deals with the African slave trade from Senegambia that heads not only across the Atlantic to Louisiana, but also north to Morocco, where these enslaved Africans formed the core of a Moroccan army. Likewise, Madagascar, the island off the southeast coast of Africa, is aflame right now, not least because of youth protests. And once again, Madagascar was once an essential node for the unlimited African slave trade. In fact, we interviewed on Freedom Now some months ago a scholar of Madagascar who suggested that the ancestry of the late Muhammad Ali could be traced back to the African slave trade from Madagascar to the United States of America. In any case, Madagascar has contradictions because on the west side of the island facing Africa in the Mozambique Channel, you have what we would routinely describe as people, melanated people, to use the term that we now use in Texas and elsewhere. And on the east side of the island, which faces the Indian Ocean, you have people who resemble the inhabitants of Indonesia, for example. And of course, Black Americans, including Andy Razaf, R-A-Z-A-F, ain't misbehaving. Of course, his roots were traced directly to that island off the southeast coast of Africa. And I should also mention, before time expires, and I know we only have a few seconds left, something we talked about at length on the Activist News Network this past Wednesday, 8 p.m., so you can tune in for a full exploration. But the booming and mushrooming trade relations between Nigeria and China, it's really something to behold, not least the Trans-Saharan Highway, which will connect Lagos in Nigeria to Algiers on the Mediterranean, and also traverse Chad and Mali and other nations in between. It's really a major project which will be a shot of adrenaline into the arm of the African economy.
And let me close with this, Dr. Horne. Captain Thomas Sankara was turned on to Marxism in Madagascar. That's where he began to study the science of Marxism, Leninism.
I understand.
So thank you.
Good luck.
All right, and I would like to thank Lisa Watson for technical brilliance per usual, and Melinda Francis. What's up now?
Yeah, I'm just encouraging and sending, good vibes to our listeners. They stay safe during the week, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.